and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. Very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to be staying in your neighborhood in South Africa to talking about the budding love affair, relationship, romance, however you want to frame it, between China and South Africa. Now, this is something that's been building up over the past few years. We've touched on it a couple of times, but really it's coming to a crescendo in the past few weeks, in part because of the dramatic economic events that are underway in China. The stock market over the past few weeks, the devaluation of the yuan, and the slump in commodity prices have all had a dramatic impact on Africa, particularly South Africa. The currency, the rand in South Africa, has hit lows for weeks now on weak economic news coming out of China. But all of this comes amid a background of tightening relationship between the two sides. And the leadership from both sides are expressing, what? Me worry? Nope, not at all. In July, Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa, he visited Beijing. Mandarin language education now will be part of the curriculum in South Africa as of next year. The ANC and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, are collaborating on a new party training school in South Africa. But lest we think this is all on the government level, let's not forget South Africa is also home to Naspers, Africa's largest media company, which made its fortune through an investment in the Chinese social networking site Tencent. Hisense is now manufacturing there, electronics, and one of China's largest automakers, First Automotive Works, is building small buses on the Eastern Cape. The list of Chinese companies in South Africa is endless, and it's going on and on. So, politics, economics, business, all of this is coming together. One man who's been writing a lot about this recently is Philip de Wit, an associate editor at the Mail and Guardian newspaper in Johannesburg. And he's going to give us a little bit of the high-level view. Welcome to the show, Philip.
Hello, gentlemen. Good to be here.
Wonderful to have you here. Why is it that the rest of Africa that spent millions of dollars out of their central banks this past week trying to defend their currency in light of the Chinese devaluation of the yuan, and a lot of Africans are now expressing shock and alarm, but in South Africa, the leadership there is really kind of relaxed about everything that's been going on. Why do you think that is?
It's not clear to us, and that's why we've been exploring this issue. We've stood somewhat amused at the quick growth of, as you say, this love affair between China and South Africa, and it really seems to be picking up pace. Now, of course, I mean, coming up in December, the all-important FOCAC, I think it's FOCAC 6 meeting will be happening in South Africa. So South Africa will be hosting this policy conference that will have at least some influence on Chinese policy towards Africa for the next 3 years or so. So there's that time element to it. But it's quite remarkable. As we speak, I haven't actually checked the flight schedules, but President Jacob Zuma should just be on his way now to China for the September 2nd celebrations. He's basically crossing in mid-air with Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa, who just came back and not only returned from that July trip, but returned from that July trip to go straight to Parliament and start extolling the virtues of the state-owned enterprise model in China. We still have this raging debate in South Africa about the teaching of Mandarin in schools. It seems to be heading to the positive. I think the majority of South Africans see this as an opportunity, although there's a little bit of suspicion, a little bit of xenophobia in the air still there. But the underneath all of this is an economic relationship that remains vastly unequal. The trade imbalance between South Africa and China is absolutely ludicrous. It's been growing steadily worse since the South African government in 2012 pointed to it and said, guys, this can't go on. We have to change this. We can't sustain this trade imbalance. There are all kinds of factors that would argue against a very close relationship, and yet the relationship is growing ever closer. It's a bit of a paradox.
Philip, in you published an article in Mail and Guardian with the provocative headline, South Africa and China, a love founded on state control. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit, and to which extent are we seeing kind of overlapping and complementary state and party cultures playing a role here?
Look, state-owned enterprises are, of of course, a bone of some contention in South Africa at the moment. We've got the state-owned electricity monopoly, Eskom, that is regularly engaging in what's called load shedding, where parts of the country have the lights turned off because there isn't enough electricity going around. We have the flag carrier, South African Airways, which is just soaking up money, bailout after bailout. The National Post Office is currently in crisis, and South Africa doesn't seem to have found its way around state-owned enterprises yet. So in light of this context, we have Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa come back from China and go, guys, the Chinese have figured out state-owned enterprises. You should see what they're doing. It's tremendous. It's enormous. We should immediately do everything that they're doing in South Africa, and taking apparently no cognizance of the vast differences between Chinese history and South African history, between the status of these state-owned enterprises, about the economy. The plans are made, and as best we can tell, the places are actually being reserved at the moment in Chinese institutions for the training of South African executives at state-owned enterprises. So the idea is that we send off these executives, they go to the government schools in China, and they come back infused with all of the knowledge that they need to turn things around. So we've been looking at this and being slightly puzzled again at why the government is so certain that the Chinese model will work in South Africa, not least of all at a time when it seems that the Chinese model is not necessarily working in China, when, there's some serious questions being raised about the performance of those state-owned entities.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrifying in many senses to read the headlines coming out of South Africa. I forget who it was. It was a minister of some kind who came back a couple weeks ago and talked about, China's got opposition parties, which of course we know that China doesn't have.
It was Tammy Kaplaiki, the I think advisor to the presidency, if I'm correct.
and referred to Chinese opposition parties. Of course, there are no Chinese opposition parties. China's a one-party state. Now we see, the deputy president, extolling the virtues of China's state-owned enterprises. Anybody who spent any amount of time in China knows that these are bloated enterprises that are not very efficient, that benefit off of, government loans. The Chinese themselves see them as corrupt beyond all imagination. I'm not saying anything that's controversial here. So it's, in some senses, disconcerting to see that the deputy president is so excited about this. And it kind of begs the question for me, as an outsider to both of you, who is speaking here? Are we talking about the African National Congress, the party that's excited to be collaborating with another similar party in the form of the Chinese Communist Party, or is this the state of South Africa that is also speaking here, state to state? I mean, or are those so intertwined, like in China, that you can't really tell the difference between the two?
Exactly. That's the situation you're dealing with. You have a situation in South Africa where essentially the kind of structures of state have merged with the structures of the party to such an extent that it's difficult to imagine how they'll be disentangled. It's increasingly becoming very difficult to imagine the ANC losing an election and then somehow leaving, like vacating those structures of government, because no one has any idea how that would happen. So in that sense, I think to my mind, and Philip, I'd love to hear what you think about this, but I think there's a certain kind of a shared culture of big party, essentially de facto one-party state politics, that is increasingly kind of overlapping. And I think, there is, the Tammy Kaplaiki comment of China having opposition parties wasn't only the weird part of that wasn't only this weird idea that they have opposition parties, but also the comment that the opposition parties are working together with the Chinese Communist Party and kind of constructively, not kind of negatively trying to break down kind of the work of the big party. So it's very clear to kind of the message that's being sent in South Africa, which has a very, very combative opposition, albeit very small opposition. Philip, what do you think?
Well, there is a great deal of party-to-party admiration, and it's very open. The African National Congress has already been sending members of the party to China for political training, to go to various political schools and training camps, and to learn not only about Chinese ideology, but about the application of that ideology. There's a great deal of admiration within the African National Congress of the developmental state model in China. There's, the ANC has this problem where it's kind of split amongst those who would like to see privatization of state assets and those who want to see the state leverage state-owned enterprises for development. It's something that threatens to tear the party apart, really. And in China, the ANC sees kind of a hybrid model where there's a bit of privatization, but it's still state-controlled and state-run, and where the state-owned enterprises are still used to move towards developmental goals. So these are the kind of things that resonate strongly within the ANC, and the differences just seem to go away. As you point out, Eric, the marked differences in the political landscape. I think sometimes deep at night, when no one is watching, there are people within the African National Congress who wish that they could have the kind of stranglehold over South African media, for instance, that you see in China, the government control.
I think some of them have actually said that on the record.
They talk about the patriotic media in China, and how everyone is moving towards the same goal. Yeah, and they phrase it in those kinds of terms. I think where the greatest admiration really lies is what the ANC sees as the policy clarity of the Chinese Communist Party, about the way that the Chinese Communist Party can have a 5-year plan, a 10-year developmental plan, and can really harness the country behind that. The ANC often tell us that they feel like they're herding cats in South Africa. They come up with a plan and they can't get anyone to agree with it, and no one wants to work with them. And we have this the word in South Africa, chacherach, that everyone is chacherach, which basically means that people keep talking back, and they won't just put their shoulders to the wheel. And perhaps therein lies what the ANC would really like to emulate in South Africa. Just get everyone behind them, behind their developmental plan, and just shut up and get the work done.
Yeah, I mean, sounds like a vast oversimplification of the Chinese political system, and it's one of those things that I think that from afar China may look that way. But when you put the magnifying glass as to how the Chinese political system actually plays out in day-to-day, it's highly combative, highly fractured, and nowhere near as centralized or as organized as many people on the outside would think. I mean, I think there's this perception, particularly it seems like in places like Pretoria, where, Xi Jinping wakes up one morning and says, you know what, everybody's going to eat oatmeal today. And the whole country eats oatmeal. And that's really something left over from the Mao era. And so I really wonder, it makes me wonder how sophisticated South African politicians really are about the way that the Chinese political system works at the granular, at the detail level. And brings up David Shambaugh, who's one of the great sinologists. He wrote a book last year, I think, where he talked about really the deficiencies in Africa of understanding China and how it sets so many African governments at a disadvantage when negotiating with the Chinese. And I wonder about this when I see these ignorant statements coming out of so many South African or ANC leaders. And so how sophisticated do you think these people are when it comes to understanding really what's going on in China?
There is no sophistication in the South African view of China. It is hugely simplistic. It is oversimplified to the point of absurdity. It takes no cognizance of the nuance at all. And of course, there are exceptions to the rule. There are analysts and people within government who I think get it. But your average South African, us in the media and certainly government functionaries simply don't get it. When confronted with paradoxes, we'll wave our hands and talk about, it's the inscrutability of the Orient. Of course, we can't understand it. There's a very utopian view. There's a very rose-tinted glass effect that happens when we look at China. And I mean, it's been said internally any number of times, and there's some political analysts who are watching in horror as our view of China grows ever more simplified and ever more optimistic, and just shake their heads sadly. But nothing they say or do seems to change that opinion.
I see this a lot in, kind of in my own work as well, because a lot of my own research is about the way that China is imaged and narrated, kind of in South Africa especially. And what I find a lot is that China is kind of a fantasy construction. And it's a fantasy construction where you can't leave the West out. Kind of it's the way that China is constructed is fundamentally influenced by how people feel about the West. So frequently, kind of at the moment, I'm busy with research at the moment at the way in which the rhino and ivory poaching crisis is discussed in South African popular media, and kind of there you have a lot of kind of negative perceptions of China as this kind of out of control monster of sex and decadence. Kind of that is very fundamentally kind of influenced by how the West thought of China, especially in the 19th century. And then frequently this utopian vision of China that you refer to, Philip, is in a way also a reaction to the West. I mean, so much of that is China is not West and therefore better. Kind of so much of that kind of way of thinking of China has this better other option. Kind of that's not as kind of corrupt or as unfair or as racist as the West. So in the end, it becomes this weird thing where you just can't really stop talking about the West, even when you're talking about China. And I think that's part of the big problem here.
Well, it sounds exactly right. Fairly recently, in the last couple of weeks, we've had the publication of the African National Congress's policy discussion documents. These are a set of documents that will go to a conference that will determine African National Congress policy and thus effectively South African policy into the future. And it's remarkable how these documents contrast the United States and China in particular. It will speak about how the United States, is this great neo-imperialist evil, as opposed to China, which is leading us into a multipolar world. It'll talk about how the US is trying to destabilize Latin America and also, by the way, destabilize China and Russia, and about economic warfare against these countries, whereas China is willing to invest in Africa and, they're partners that we can trust. And that thread just it comes up again and again and again in these documents. It really does seem, I hear what Cobus says when he talks about China being the opposite of the West in the eyes of our policymakers in South Africa. Everything that is put on paper points towards that, yes.
But let's kind of step away now from the policy side and the policymaker side and look at the people. South Africa is home to the largest population of Chinese migrants in all of Africa. It's a population that dates back a very, very long time. Obviously, South Africa is a multiracial society, in many ways far more diverse than other countries in Africa. What's your sense that how the masses are seeing this relationship, if they are seeing it at all?
We've been watching xenophobia very closely in South Africa, and especially in South African townships. We have had a couple of incidents lately, again, where xenophobic violence has flared up and where especially foreign shopkeepers have been targeted and had their shops looted and so on. Some nasty instances of violence. Some of those, but very few of those shopkeepers were Chinese. So I must stress that we've got a very large population of Somali shopkeepers in South African townships, quite a few Pakistanis or Indian shopkeepers, people from Bangladesh. And the Chinese shopkeepers, such as they are, were not directly targeted. But that has seen us explore these attitudes towards foreigners in South Africa. And again, we find the strange thing where people of African descent, even second-generation immigrants from elsewhere in Africa, in South Africa, face a considerable harder time than, for instance, your Chinese immigrants. People from Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo are viewed with far more suspicion than people of Chinese descent. And I can't tell you why. I don't think any of our sociologists have yet put their finger quite on why that is. But it's in stark contrast to places like Angola, for instance, where we see that Chinese immigrants are treated with vast amounts of suspicion, and they're the target of public ire to an extent that we simply don't see in South Africa. I'm just going to count that up to the inscrutability of the Orient again, because I can't tell you why.
Well, kind of friends of mine who academics who work in migration have mentioned to me that there are increasingly, even though Chinese shopkeepers aren't necessarily targeted, kind of as much as Somalis or Congolese, the paranoia that they are going to be is very, very strong in the community. And, kind of that together with perceptions that they come in for a lot of police harassment and a lot of kind of corrupt police treatment, kind of like demanding of bribes, and also for crime, just kind of non-xenophobic, just simple crime. Kind of that perception runs high, and that is at the moment combining with worries about the weakening of the South African economy. And apparently there is quite a lot of reverse migration back to China, kind of happening, as well as onward migration to other countries. So, kind of like acquaintances and friends of mine who are, for example, are from communities that came before the current Fujian migration wave to South Africa, who came from, for example, from Taiwan during the 1970s, whose family came from there. Almost none of the relatives are, kind of are in South Africa anymore. Kind of like they grew up with large families in South Africa, and almost all of the relatives are living in Canada and the US and the UK and so on. So there's a lot of onward migration as well. And a lot of that is driven by perceptions that it's getting harder and harder and harder to do business in South Africa. It's harder to make money than it used to be. And they're being harassed and they're being victimized. So, kind of, so the perceptions have their own power, I think.
Hey, Philip, let's just wrap this conversation up by looking forward a little bit. So we're seeing the continued integration on the political level, the party level. Clearly, the economies of the two are bound when you see the rand move in sync with all of the economic data coming out of China. Where's this all going in the next 3 to 5 years?
To a deeper and greater love. Absolutely. There is absolutely no sign whatsoever, even in the midst of this upheaval in Chinese markets, there is no sign whatsoever that the South African government, or the African National Congress for that matter, are reconsidering their policy positions on China, that they'll be doing anything but moving closer to China. The medium-term plans, the long-term plans, all of the frameworks have China at their heart. The focus on China is unrelenting, and there seems to be absolutely nothing that can change that. Wow.
Cobus, did that surprise you?
No, not really. Kind of, we have been seeing this for a while. What I'm very interested in is to see whether that close alignment can actually migrate out of these super elite levels and actually kind of move down, kind of down the ladder to everyday South African life. I mean, the teaching of Mandarin will be very interesting to watch in South African schools. I am very doubtful that they're going to be able to pull it off. I just have no idea how they're going to pay for it and where the teachers are coming from, even with Chinese government funding, which I saw in some regions, kind of discussion that there might be funding coming for it. Even with funding, I'd be very doubtful about whether it can actually be widely implemented. But we'll see. And, kind of, if kids start learning Mandarin, if lots of South African kids start learning Mandarin, then that's going to be an interesting kind of generational shift. Kind of that could bring some kind of closer alignment, a more permanent closer alignment. But yeah, it's early days, I guess.
Listen, as a Mandarin speaker myself, I think it would be just fantastic if a lot of South African children learn Mandarin, just because it just opens up the world. I mean, you see a different universe when you speak other people's languages. I got to say that I'm just so fed up with the xenophobic reaction from the teachers' unions there about language studies, and that it's some kind of neo-imperialism or colonialism. So just my last 2 words there on language learning. Listen, if you want to follow what's been going on in South Africa in the relationship with China, there's no better place to go than over to the Mail and Guardian's website. Do a search for Philip de Wet. He's been writing on this quite a bit. There's 2 really good articles that I'd like to point you to. Essays, South Africa and China, A Love Founded on State Control, that was written on the 21st of August. And then an essay that came out, a news analysis, just last week on the 28th of August, South Africa Stays Loyal as Chinese Party Fizzles, talking about the economic relationship and how really South Africa is standing by while others are fretting a lot more. Philip, thank you so much for joining us on the show and for your excellent writing and analysis on the subject. What we'd like to do at the end of every program is really kind of connect you with our audience. And if people want to follow what you're reading and writing and what you're reporting on these days, what's the best way that they can stay in touch with you?
Mail and Guardian website is always a good option. I'm all over Twitter as Philip de Wet, or just do the search for Mail and Guardian. Google will point you to me.
That's mg.co.za. Really, we post almost every article that's related to China Africa on our Facebook page at facebook.com/China Africa Project, where Cobus and I are updating the site 24 hours a day, actually, which is rather compulsive and obsessive, Cobus.
Yeah, it's worrying. But I'm there. I'm usually see on our Facebook page, and I'm also on Twitter at Stadenesque. That's STADENESQUE.
And Facebook is a great place for if you've got questions about China-Africa relations or you disagree with what we say here on the podcast. Let us know. Just post up right there, or you can contact me on Twitter. I'm at EOLander, EOLANDER. But if all of this is a little too intense and just too much, and you just want a little bit of China-Africa news, we really recommend our weekly newsletter. Go to our website at ChinaAfricaProject.com. You can sign up. Cobus and I put together 4 or 5 articles, really the top stories, including actually some of Philip's reporting. And we send that out to you every Monday afternoon. So you can, it'll be in your email inbox, and that's a great way just to stay on top of the top stories. So we'll be back again very soon with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Thank you so much for listening.